Mahashi's consciousness-based education to develop the total creative potential of every student. Ashley Dinz, PhD, Director, Mahashi School of the Age of Enlightenment, Fairfield, Iowa, USA. Part 1. The need to provide what has been missing in education, the full development of the consciousness of the student.
Welcome to this presentation on Maharishi consciousness-based education, a system of education that develops the total creative potential of every student. You know, the problem with education today is that it does not develop the total creative potential of every student. In fact, many students today drop out of education right after high school or even before. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, what is it that's missing from education? It clearly isn't a problem with the system, particularly because no matter what country in the world you go to today, people are always complaining about the system of education. And so having one country adopt another country's system of education isn't a very good way to proceed. It would be like moving the deck chairs around on the Titanic when what we really have to do is to fix the leak, because there's a very serious leak in the education of every country today. So let's look for a moment to see what could be missing. What could be the fundamental component of education that is missing from every system of education in the world today? Well, we could say that there are three fundamental components to education. There is the known, that which is known, that we find in libraries and on the internet. There is the process of knowing, and there is the knower. Now, modern education, we could call it information-based education or fact-based education, focuses primarily on the known, that which is known. And we're actually very good at that. In fact, there is more known than can be known. In fact, there is so much known that trying to get the student to assimilate all of the known that we know is very stressful to the student. Imagine that you're a student who is a very conscientious student and you wanted to know everything, and you go into a library with 10 million volumes. Well, even the sight of 10 million volumes would be intimidating, if not depressing. But suppose you locked yourself in the library and you read every single book that there was in the library, all 10 million volumes, then when you emerged 3 or 4 years later, you would find that a new library had been built next door containing an equal number of volumes, and you'd be 4 years out of date. So that is why the amount of knowledge today is overwhelming. In fact, one of the deans at Massachusetts Institute of Technology told me recently that trying to be a student at MIT is like trying to drink from a fire hose. There's a lot of pressure on you, and most of it gets past you. And that is the experience of students today in information-based education. Fact after fact after fact to be memorized, more and more testing, more and more evaluations, and a build-up of stress. And of course, we'll see later on in this presentation that stress has a very, very deleterious effect on the student's nervous system. So we can see that there's a vast amount of known. And this is overwhelming to the student and actually stifles the student's innate desire to know everything. Now imagine you go into a classroom in kindergarten or in grade 1 or into a group of students who are 6 or 7 years old, and what you'll find anywhere in the world is that these students have an insatiable desire to know. They're always asking questions. They're always asking questions like, where do the birds go in the wintertime? And then if you say, well, they go south, they say, why? And you say, well, because it gets cold. And they say, why does it get cold? And you say, well, because the earth rotates around the sun and its axis is tilted, and therefore, and they'll say, why? And you can see that anyone who's ever looked after a 6-year-old has that experience, that they're always asking for more knowledge, always asking for answers to questions. But if you go into a classroom of 16-year-olds, you'll have a different experience. If you can get them to ask a question, the question they'll probably ask you first is this going to be on the test? Because by then they've realized there is so much information they have to restrict what they can learn, so that they can get through the next test and get through the next test and get their diploma. And this restrictive approach to knowledge actually damages the functioning of the brain. Because the brain, the human brain, is a remarkable organ, but it's really a use it or lose it organ. When you give it an experience and use it in some particular channel, it'll develop in that channel. And for example, if you give your child violin lessons, what is going to happen is that the area of the motor cortex responsible for moving the fingers of the left hand is going to develop, whereas the area responsible for moving the fingers of the right hand, which don't move at all when you're playing the violin, won't develop as much. So these narrow specific tasks that the brain is given actually develop narrow specific channels within the brain. So when a child is at school, they're studying mathematics, they're developing one area of the brain. When they're studying art, another area of the brain. When they're studying literature, another area of the brain. But nothing is developed at school that will develop the whole brain. And so the students end up with this partial fragmented knowledge leading to partial fragmented brain development. And in fact, the situation gets even worse the further a student goes on through education. The system of education today is so unsatisfying that 50% of the students in most countries, probably more, drop out at the end of high school. They don't go on to take a higher degree. But even those who do, if they have a desire to know everything, and I remember when I went to university, I really was excited about it. I thought, now I'm really going to meet interesting people. I'm going to learn a great deal. And what was the experience? Well, if you go into a university and say, I still have a desire to know everything, please teach me everything, they'll probably laugh at you. They'd say, well, you have to do Psychology 101 or Mathematics 101 or Literature 101 or maybe in your case Logic 101, because you don't seem to have a very good understanding of how a university works. And so you say, well, then I'll take literature, because you want to know, but you can only take what they offer you. And after 2 years of a literature degree, how do you feel? One night you might be sitting at dinner with your fellow students, and one is talking about microbiology, and one is talking about computer science, and one about physics or mathematics or chemistry or all of the other different disciplines, sociology, law, medicine, whatever it is. And you begin to realize that you don't really understand anything that they're saying. You realize your sphere of ignorance is expanding more rapidly than your sphere of knowledge. And that is a byproduct, a harmful side effect of modern education. And of course, all that time you're just developing this very narrow channel of the brain by reading literature. But suppose you then decide to go on and take a master's degree, and in the United States only 10% of all the students go on to take a higher degree, then would you be able to take a master's degree in literature? You'd probably be advised that that's too broad a subject for a master's degree. You'd have to take it in French literature or English literature or American literature. And again, you're narrow channeling the brain into these very fragmented styles of functioning. And then when you finished your master's degree, if you wanted to do a PhD, say in French literature, that's way too broad a subject. You would have to specialize, maybe French literature from 1832 to 1834 from a Marxist perspective. That would be a typical PhD thesis. And after 5 years of that, your brain is very, very narrowly channeled, and they'll say, oh, congratulations, you're now one of the most highly educated people in the nation. Go out and lead the world. Well, any honest PhD knows that they know almost everything about virtually nothing. They've been channeled into this very, very narrow little area where they can hardly communicate with anybody else. And this, of course, all the time is narrowing the functioning of the brain, making it more and more fragmented. And so we could say today that really education, with its inability to develop the total creative potential of the individual, is responsible really for all of the problems we see in society. The educated people have been unable to prevent or solve the problems that have plagued mankind for generations. So what is the solution? Well, I've been saying that partial fragmented knowledge creates partial or fragmented brain development. So therefore we might conclude that if we could give the student total knowledge, then total knowledge might lead to total brain development. But where would we locate total knowledge in the world today? Well, if we look at the discipline of physics, we get some insight into the fact that there is actually a field of total knowledge which lies beneath the surface, superficial level of the functioning of the universe. If we look anywhere in nature, if we look anywhere, we'll find that below the superficial level there's molecules and there's atoms and there's nuclei and there's subatomic particles. And those subatomic particles, physics has found over the last few decades, themselves become progressively more unified at finer time and distance scales, culminating in the discovery of the unified field of natural law. At the basis of the whole universe is one field which can be located anywhere at a fine enough time and distance scale, and that is a field of unity, a field where all the laws of nature are found in a fully unified state. So if we could study one thing at college, whether we would study medicine or we would study art or we would study music, if we studied the unified field, at least then we would have our hand on the seed of total knowledge. Now, of course, studying the unified field in physics is a formidable undertaking involving many years of undergraduate, graduate and postgraduate research. It certainly isn't something that everyone would relish to do. But it does give us a glimpse that physics has found and discovered this field underlying all of the diversity in the universe. In fact, the term universe is uni-verse, diversity coming from unity. So at the basis of the universe is a field of total knowledge, a field of unity, a field of infinite organizing power, dynamism, silence, creative intelligence, all unified into one field. Now, how could we actually make use of this field, experience this field in daily life? Well, in Maharshi's consciousness-based education, which is Vedic education, the unified field of natural law is open to the direct experience of the student. Let's just examine how this could be. We've understood that one of the major components of education is the known. So let's suppose we go into a library and we look at the 10 million volumes. Here is the known. But these 10 million books have come from somewhere. What do they contain? Where do they come from? Well, a book obviously comes from a printer. And a printer has come from a word processor. And the word processor was attached to a keyboard, and the keyboard is activated by the fingers of the author. And the mind of the author activates the fingers. And the mind of the author responds to the thoughts that are flowing through the author's mind. So we could say, really, that any book is really fossilized human thought. And if you have 10 million volumes, then there is the fossilized human thought of approximately 10 million authors. But all the knowledge that we call the known has originally arisen as the flow of creativity, intelligence, and thought of an author. And students spend their whole careers studying the thoughts of other people. Now, in Maharshi's consciousness-based education, the student is able to have the experience of the source of thought. If you've ever thought for a moment, where was a thought before I thought it? It's really a very profound question, because thoughts just seem to come into our mind. But every thought is a flow of creativity and a flow of intelligence. And since all knowledge in the libraries has come as this flow of thoughts, then the source of thought must be an infinite reservoir of creativity and intelligence, because thoughts are always coming into our mind. From the minute we wake up in the morning, we're thinking, what do I do now? I have to go shopping, I have to drop off the children at school, I have to get lunch, I have to go to do the dry cleaning. Until 10 o'clock at night, the mind is full of thoughts. Each of these thoughts is a flow of creativity and intelligence. So in consciousness-based education, one of the fundamental components is called the Transcendental Meditation Program. And the Transcendental Meditation Program allows any student to have the experience of finer and finer levels of thinking, quieter, more vague, more subtle levels of thought, and to transcend the subtlest impulse of thought and experience the source of thought, a field of pure, unbounded consciousness, unbounded awareness, which is pure wakefulness, the experience of the self, the experience of the knower, the component of education that has been missing from modern education. And when the student comes out from that experience, then they are more creative and more intelligent, they're more alert, more awake, and they're a better student. So think of an analogy for a moment to make this a little more concrete, because I know this is a very abstract concept. If you make an analogy between an ocean and the mind. Now think of the ocean, it has waves on the surface. So if you go down to the ocean, you might go down one day and you'll see one type of wave, you go on the next day and there's another type of wave, and you might begin to think, oh, the nature of the ocean is waves. But if you had a way of letting the ocean settle down, take a particular wave, let that wave get more unbounded and quieter, transcend the subtlest impulse of the wave, what we experience is what? That there's the flat, silent, unbounded ocean. And that unbounded ocean is the source of any type of wave. It's really the field of total knowledge of all possible waves. Just like that in the mind, in the transcendental meditation technique, this effortless program allows the student to experience finer and finer and finer levels of a thought, transcend the subtlest impulse of thought, and they experience that unbounded ocean of consciousness at the source of thought, that unbounded ocean that is the source of any type of thought, any creative impulse. It's an infinite reservoir of creativity and intelligence. And this experience develops total brain functioning, because this is the experience of the field of total knowledge. So total knowledge, the experience of which gives rise to total coherent brain functioning. And this is the experience, this is the program that has been missing from all forms of education. Because everyone knows that we're good at delivering the known. Now, the second element would be the process of knowing. How do we know the known? That's a little bit more abstract. How do we get the knowledge from the blackboard into the student? Well, obviously it involves teaching techniques, it involves brain processes such as analysis and synthesis, and not much emphasis is put on that in schools. And then the third element, the knower, is completely lacking in modern education, giving the student the experience of themselves, the experience of this infinite reservoir of creativity and intelligence that exists within everyone. This is the experience that is added in Maharshi's consciousness-based education. And physicists today have pointed out that because the human physiology is actually an expression of the unified field, that everything about us, our mind, our intellect, our ego, our feelings, everything, are all expressions of the unified field, then when we transcend during transcendental meditation, we're actually having the experience not just of the source of our own creativity and intelligence, not just the source of every other human being's creativity and intelligence, but the source of the infinite organizing power and intelligence responsible for governing the whole universe. So the individual student is then connecting their little laptop computer, which we could call the human brain, with the cosmic computer, the mainframe. And then the individual intelligence can take on that same style of functioning as cosmic intelligence. So this is what has been missing from education, the ability to develop the total creative potential of the student. And William James, the father of modern psychology, said about 100 years ago that the average person uses a small fraction, say 5% of their full mental potential. Well, this isn't a very great endorsement of education, because if we turn it around, we can say modern education fails to develop 95% of the student's creative potential. But with consciousness-based education, we can now see, and you'll be seeing in a few minutes, the scientific research on the brain and on the intelligence and creativity of students who practice the Transcendental Meditation program, that consciousness-based education really does develop the whole brain physiology and develop the total creative potential of the student. Now, if this has been a little bit abstract, I'd like now to make it very concrete by showing you what happens when we introduce consciousness-based education into a school. And a few years ago, a school in Detroit, Michigan, in the United States, which is an inner city school where the children have a lot of stress in their lives, decided that it would introduce the Transcendental Meditation program in order to help the students cope with stress. And this program was so successful in the school that it has now really resulted in national attention and now actually international attention. And the program NBC Today came and did a feature on the Nataki Taliba Playhouse in Detroit, Michigan. And I'd like to show you this now, just to show you what actually happens when the Transcendental Meditation program is introduced into just an ordinary school.
Well, now there's a school in Detroit that's helping students deal with this stress in a unique way. Here's NBC's Kevin Tibbles.
The boisterous kids at Detroit's Nataki Taliba School are really no different than any others, except perhaps for 10 minutes twice a day when all they hear is silence. These students aren't napping, they're meditating. Transcendental meditation was brought to the West 40 years ago by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and made popular by the Beatles in the late 60s. And today, it's used in this school as a stress buster.
It's not a religion, it's not a philosophy, it's not a way of life. It's simply a mental technique. It allows the system, the mind and the body to settle down and gain a very, very deep rest.
According to these kids, it helps.
I have a tendency to dwell on things that happened in the past, but when I meditate, then it helps me let them go.
I just pay attention better now.
After meditation, I feel great.
When we think of packing our kids off to school these days, we often worry about the problems: high stress, substance abuse, even violence, things that threaten a child's education. But can 10 minutes of quiet time really make a difference? The research says yes. The University of Michigan followed 140 of the school's 10 to 14-year-olds.
They felt more connected, they felt happier, satisfied, peaceful, calm.
I used to get angry a lot, but now it's like I'm calming down.
And studies show meditating kids actually do better in school than kids who don't.
My grade point average has went up a lot, from a 3.4 to a 3.8. Now I'm doing much better. I've evolved. At first in science, I got a B, but now my grade is up to an A.
And when your grades are that good, who cares what your skeptical friends think?
They just think it's the weirdest thing in the world, because my best friend said that they wouldn't be able to sit that still for maybe 3 seconds, but they just telling us the best thing.
For today, Kevin Tibbles, NBC News, Detroit.
And joining us now is Nataki Taliba School Principal Carmen Anamdi. Carmen, good morning to you.
Good morning, how are you?
I'm great, thanks. Did this start out as a way to boost scores, or was your goal simply to get the kids focused?
No, I learned to meditate about 30 years ago, and that was really the first time that I ever started thinking about stress and the impact that stress has on our behavior. So I thought, why not introduce this to 10-year-olds? We, if you've noticed now as adults, we're all in the bookstores getting the self-help books, and every time you read one, you think, gee, I wish somebody had told me this when I was 10. So really that was my desire, is to really begin to make them aware of stress and how stress impacts on your behavior.
Well, they're clearly calm as I look at them behind you there. I'm wondering if this was a tough sell to the parents. Does transcendental meditation have a religious connotation, for example, to some folks?
No, not at all. We began the program 6 years ago. And there were 180 students at the time. There were only 8 families that did not allow their children to participate in the program. And I think it's the word meditation. I think that people associate that with religion, but there's absolutely no beliefs. That's why I like the technique. It doesn't impose on any of your beliefs or your lifestyle or anything. It's just a physical technique.
And I guess there are misconceptions I had that when I heard I was doing this segment, I went, did the hum. That's not part of it. We saw those kids in absolute silence in the tape.
No. There isn't even any concentration. It's really a very free-flowing thing. I don't like anything that causes me to have to alter myself. The only discipline that this requires is that you do it every day. You know how you look in the mirror and you say, gee, I'm not physically fit, and so you go and exercise and you think that'll make you physically fit? No, not for that day. You have to do it over a period of time,
well, Carmen,
to really see any benefit.
This is not cheap. I know you've had some donations, some grants to the school, but it's an expensive proposition for most schools, I would think.
Oh, that's true. Yes, Chrysler, the Daimler Chrysler Foundation is the one that really initiated the program for us, and then General Motors also began to be one of our sponsors. But you know, that's the way it is in this country. Anything that's healthy for us is expensive. It's like healthcare.
Hey, are the teachers doing this too?
The teachers do this too. We found that there were some studies that have been done across the nation that say that only 1 out of 4 teachers remains in the profession, and I think that's scary. And I think part of it is because teaching is a very demanding profession, very stressful, and so I'm glad to offer it as a health benefit.
Well, Carmen and Amdi, thanks so much for coming on and talking about this.
Thank you.
What you can see from this video, I think, are several things. Firstly, the Transcendental Meditation program must be very easy. Otherwise, 10 to 14-year-old children wouldn't be able to do it. Secondly, it must be very enjoyable, because otherwise 10 to 14-year-old children wouldn't be able to sit still for 10 to 15 minutes in the morning and 10 to 15 minutes in the afternoon. In fact, the Transcendental Meditation program is extremely enjoyable because the experience of the source of thought, this infinite reservoir of creativity and intelligence within all of us, is a very blissful experience. So it's one that the students enjoy, it's one that the students really look forward to. Thirdly, you see from this video that Transcendental Meditation is not a religion. It doesn't involve any belief at all. Whether you believe in a deity or not, it doesn't matter. You can be the sort of person who believes everything they hear, or the sort of person who doesn't believe anything they hear, or halfway in between, but the technique doesn't depend on belief. It isn't a religion, it's not faith-based. It's a mechanical, effortless, natural, simple technique that allows the mind to settle down. Now, when the mind settles down to that experience of pure consciousness within, then the body settles down, experiences a deep level of rest, is able to revitalize and rejuvenate itself, and then of course the student is more prepared to learn. Because the thing is that with consciousness-based education, it relies on the fact that students exist in different states of consciousness. Now, when I ask teachers what are the 2 least popular times of the week to be teaching a class, they invariably answer first thing Monday morning and last thing Friday afternoon. Now, why is that? It's because they intuitively know that students exist in different states of consciousness. So when a student comes in on a Monday morning, generally they haven't really been on a very good routine on the weekend or whatever, and they're tired. So you could imagine maybe that the back row are in the sleeping state of consciousness. Now, when they're in the sleeping state of consciousness, how much learning actually takes place? Nothing. Now, sleeping is a good thing, and students should get enough sleep, but in the classroom is not the place for it. And by Friday afternoon, perhaps, they're in the dreaming state of consciousness, dreaming about the weekend. Again, dreaming is a different state of consciousness. It's illusory awareness. No learning of verbs takes place in dreaming. They may be dreaming they're being chased by a tiger. They won't learn anything in the classroom. And then, of course, there are always some students, hopefully, in the front row who are awake in various degrees of wakefulness. But you always hope that some of the students are very alert and very intelligent and wide awake. Now, what the Transcendental Meditation program does, as you've seen in this DVD that we played, it makes the students say things like, I used to be worried about things, but now I'm able to let it go. My grades are improving. I'm paying attention better in class. After meditation, I feel great. I used to get angry a lot, but now I'm calming down. These are all indications of the development of the knower, developing the student into higher states of consciousness where they're more able to learn effectively.
Part 2. Research on the Transcendental Meditation Program, developing the total creative potential of the student.
So I'd like to now show you some of the research that's been done on the brain and showing that the Transcendental Meditation Program and consciousness-based education really does develop the total creative potential of the student. And I'm very grateful to Dr. Fred Travis for the information contained in the following slides. In this first slide, we see that stress restricts brain structure and function. So we don't want to actually stress the students while we're educating them. I mentioned earlier that modern information-based education is very stressful to students, and that in turn is damaging to the function of the brain. If we look at, on the left-hand side here, the neuronal structure of a newborn, we'll see that the neurons are really not connected to each other very much. We're born with billions of neurons, and it's really a clean slate. And what we actually expose the child to will actually determine how the brain actually develops. You see in the middle slide, after 3 months, the neurons are beginning to connect. After 6 months, there are many more connections. This is a period known as neural exuberance, where there are about 40,000 new neuronal connections being made every second. So what is this baby's brain actually doing? Well, if the baby is born in, say, Holland, then these neuronal connections are forming in such a way that the baby can understand Dutch. And after about a year, they can do that. If the baby is born in Paris, then a different set of neuronal connections are being formed, so the baby can understand French. So everything that we see, everything we hear, taste, touch, or smell is actually digested by the brain and actually alters the structure of the brain itself. Now, what's also happening is the output fibers from the cell body in the brain are myelinating, and this begins at about the age of 3 years old. So if you ever played a game of ball with a 3-year-old, you'll notice you throw the ball and it's very difficult for them to catch it because they can't respond quickly enough. This is the process of myelination that's necessary in order to speed up the transmission of information down the neuron, about 16 to 20 times. So a fatty coating is formed, and this allows the brain to function more efficiently. Now, the interesting thing is that the prefrontal and frontal areas of the brain, which we could call the executive areas of the brain, do not begin myelinating until about the age of 12. And the prefrontal cortex is that area of the brain that is responsible for judgment, decision-making, planning, moral reasoning, working memory, and sense of self. So that's why we don't leave a child under 12 alone without an adult, because they're not really fully developed in terms of making good decisions and having good judgment. The interesting thing here is this word begin. It says begin myelinating at the age of 12. It doesn't finish myelinating until the age of 25. And of course, insurance companies have known this for years. 25 is the age at which you get the lowest rates on your car insurance, because very often teenagers don't have good judgment or decision making or planning. And so the brain of a young person up to the age of 25 is still developing, and therefore it's very, very important that they be exposed to life-supporting values and not be subjected to stress during this very tender time where their brain is actually developing. Here is a chart that shows a brain, and if we put something in front on the left-hand side, maybe we put a book in front of the brain, then the eyes will see the book, and that information will be transmitted to the right-hand side of the screen, where a concrete image of the book is formed at the back of the brain. So this concrete image forms on the screen of the mind. And then that information is sent to the prefrontal cortex, which we could call the CEO, or Chief Executive Officer of the brain. Now, if this is a 5-year-old brain and you put, say, Shakespeare in the book, then what will a 5-year-old prefrontal cortex tell the child to